All right, today I'm going to be talking about the life of Joseph and his colorful coat, or so we like to think. When I first picked this, I didn't realize how much of Joseph's story there really is. So we won't be going into details on everything that you could possibly get out of this story of Joseph's life. So we're going to kind of condense it into just the basics of what happened and what we can learn from what Joseph went through. All right, so his life, and as I said, it's a big story. It begins in Genesis 37 and basically goes to the end of the book of Genesis to chapter 50. So, pretty much all of that aside from one section is not specifically Joseph, but it is connected to Joseph's family. So, all of those chapters in Genesis revolve around Joseph or his family. And we're going to talk about four phases of his life. And as you can see, I went full on alliteration and teacher mode. And I thought of like, this is what Baptist preachers tend to do. They pick a pick a letter and everything starts with that letter. So we have the four phases of Joseph's life here: the pit, Potiphar, prison, and the palace. So we're going to be looking through those four things of his life and just kind of talking about what he went through, and then we'll go back and talk about what we can learn from everything that Joseph experienced. So that's kind of what we're going to do today, walk through his life and then look at what can we learn from this story of Joseph and how he responded to the situations that came upon him. So the first one is obviously the pit. He wasn't in there very long, but I think it did have a very important impact on his life and set him on the path God wanted him to be in. We're going to talk about that in a little more in a few moments, but it was also the lowest point of his life because he's literally underground. They've thrown him into this pit which was basically like a well to catch rainwater. So, it probably wasn't very deep, but deep enough he couldn't climb his way out easily without help. So, not a fun place to be in. And it all began with his coat. So I started thinking about like we typically tend to think of Joseph's coat as having all of these bright colors and just this fantastic coat, and it definitely was probably that, or at least gave some kind of significance to Joseph. And I was doing some research into it just cuz I was kind of curious like what did his coat actually maybe look like? And I kind of I found some information basically that said a lot of the colors that people like to put on the coats, and we might even see it in the play today. There's colors that actually didn't exist. They didn't have a way to create those colors yet. Most of the colors were likely used when they did do color dyes on fabric. It was probably not very often, and it was used for plants, animals, and even crushed insects were used to dye the colors. So they may have looked more like the second coat here, where the colors are a little bit more deep and muted and not so bright, and there may have only been a few colors. Did some research and I found out that it most likely, if it had any colors, it would have had a like deep blues, a brick red, and like an earthy tone of a yellow, maybe. So those would have been the main three colors that you might have seen people using in that time. So kind of like this second coat. And another note that I found is that it would have been a long sleeved garment and it would have been long down to their ankles, basically signifying that this person is not meant to work in the fields. They're not meant to go and get dirty. They're meant for something more. So that obviously enraged his brothers that he got this coat. So whatever it may have looked like, it definitely said to them that like I don't want Jacob was saying to his brothers or to Joseph's brothers in a way basically like I don't want Joseph out in the fields. He's my favorite. So just by giving him that coat, he was saying all of that. And I don't think he did it thinking they were going to be jealous. I think he just loved Joseph so much and he wanted to honor him in this way. And so he went and got this coat for him. But yeah, so we're not really sure what it exactly looked like, but it more probably would have looked more closely like this long sleeved coat here rather than the very brightly colored one on the other side with all the decorations. So probably something simple, maybe just a few colors on it if it had any color. Um, So, yeah, I just thought that was interesting. I've always kind of wondered, like, what did his coat really look like? So I did a little research for you guys that I wanted to share with you. So, Joseph the Dreamer. So, he's been given this coat. Then something else happens that further causes problems with him and his brothers. And it's funny because in this story, you never really see Joseph feeling upset about it. He's just trying to like have a relationship with his brothers. And the brothers are like behind his back almost like getting upset about it. And I don't even know, it's unclear to us really like if Joseph knows that his brothers feel this way, you know? So anyway, but his dreams that he has basically foreshadow that his family will bow down at his feet and he will rule over them, which of course upsets them. So only Jacob seems to wonder if there's a little more meaning to this. So he has two basic dreams of things bowing down to him. There's one with the sun, moon, and stars bowing down, and that's the one where Jacob seems to think that maybe it means that even Joseph's parents will one day bow down to him, and he kind of rebukes him for it, but he keeps it in mind because I think he knows that maybe there's some meaning behind this that we just don't yet understand. So anyway, in Genesis 37, we see that here that his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. That's all it really tells us, but I think it is kind of saying that like Jacob kind of realizes maybe there's more to this dream than we know. So he's a little upset by it, but he's kind of also has that open mind of maybe this means something. So he keeps the dream in mind, and that's all we really hear about it for then. So then things get really crazy. The brothers are at this point after they've seen Joseph been given this coat that signifies him as a favorite of Jacob and sort of in their minds puts Joseph above themselves. So they don't like this. And then they've been told two different dreams that Joseph has had where basically the meaning is obvious that they will one day bow down to him. So Joseph really didn't comment anything about it other than just report the dream to them. And then they took that interpretation, which we'll see turns out to be correct. But they're very mad. So in Genesis 37, Joseph has been sent from his father to go check on his brothers out in the fields. And so he goes on this long journey to find them. And they see him coming, and we're gonna pick up reading here in Genesis 37:19. They said, "Here comes that dreamer." So they even like give him a little nickname because they're so upset about his dreams. They said to each other, "Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. "Let's not take his life," he said. "Don't shed any blood. Throw him into this cistern here in the wilderness, and don't lay a hand on him." Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. So Reuben has this plan of like, okay, let's not actually get Joseph's blood on our hands. Let's just throw him in here because Reuben's going to come back later and rescue Joseph and send him back home to his dad. So he's away from the brothers and the brothers can calm down. So that's Reuben's plan. So when Joseph did arrive to the brothers, because they've seen him walking from afar, so they've been able to have this conversation, you know, before he was within hearing distance, I guess. So they stripped him of the robe and they took him and threw him into the cistern. And the cistern was empty and there was no water in it. So I kind of found a picture here of an illustration of them taking the coat from Joseph, and you kind of see their faces. I think they're really portrayed well with the anger, and Joseph's like, what did I do? Why are we mad?" You know, his face of like shock of like, what is going on? Why are they acting like this? And then I have here a picture of what might have been like, it looks more like a well, but so it could have been something like a well or just a big hole in the ground, possibly with, I would think, some kind of stone wall around it just to signify that it's there so people and animals didn't accidentally stumble into it. And basically, it was meant to catch water when it would rain. But because it's a desert climate that they're in, it's very hot and it's dry. And I think that's an important note. The Bible here tells us in the story that there was no water in it. So, kind of in a way, it saves Joseph from like drowning down there because it's empty. But it also, on the other hand, is really hot, which is also significant because if they left Joseph too long in this hot pit, it's hot, dry, and he would definitely die. But Reuben, has this plan. He's going to come back later and rescue Joseph before that would happen, I guess, is his thinking. So it continues. This part I thought was interesting because they threw him in the pit, and as they sat down to eat their meals, so they sit down to eat while Joseph is in the pit. And they looked up and they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh. They were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." His brothers agreed. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. So, Reuben's first attempt was to save Joseph by just saying, "Hey, leave him in here," and he was going to come back later when they weren't paying attention and get Joseph out and tell him, run home. Go, get away from them. Then Judah thinks of like, okay, we don't need to just leave him here because our hands are on him. We threw him in there. And that's like instant death if we leave him there. We're the last ones that interacted with him. I think that's probably Judah's thought process at this point. And so he's thinking, okay, hey, let's sell him to these guys, and they'll be the last ones that interacted with him. So if anything happens, it's not on us. I think that's kind of what he's saying here. And so they ended up pulling him out, selling him to the to the traveling caravan there that takes him to Egypt. And this is an important event, not just for Joseph, but for all of Israel. Because I started thinking about this, and as I was reading some books about Joseph, it kind of explained this idea that, like, basically, it sets Israel, the nation, on a path toward Egypt, where one day they're all going to be enslaved and delivered by God through Moses. So this is like the start of that. Like, how they get to Egypt is through Joseph. This one event is just like, it seems so small. It seems like sad for Joseph that his brothers sell him away and he gets taken off into a foreign land. But yet, there's this bigger picture through the whole Bible that we're going to see later on. It sets them on this path toward that. And we're going to have the story of Moses later on in Exodus. So, I thought that was a really interesting point that I read about in my book, and I was like thinking about it. I was like, yeah, basically, like, you could just see how God's working through everything because his people are gonna end up there and he's gonna save them again. So it's interesting how it all starts to tie together. So I've got a couple questions for you guys. Have you had a time in your life where you felt stuck in a pit? Maybe not a literal pit like Joseph, but something that kind of made you feel like you were stuck, like you couldn't get out. And how did you persevere? What did you do? So I'm gonna give y'all a moment to talk at your table about that. All right, next we're on the next phase of of Joseph's life, and that's Potiphar's household. So after the pit, he gets sold to the Ishmaelites who travel to take him to Egypt, and he ends up with Potiphar becoming a servant there. And Potiphar is an official in Egypt, basically, and so a couple things that we can take notice of here during his time with Potiphar is that Joseph realizes, and I think we see Joseph's gifts that he gets from the Lord. We see gifts of leadership and administration start to come through, and the Lord was with Joseph during this time. There's several times during the story that it tells us the Lord was with Joseph. And we're going to read and look at Genesis 39, verses 2 through 6 here. The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted his care everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household and of all he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessings of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in his house and the fields. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care, and with Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food that he ate. So during this time with Potiphar, he really starts to grow those gifts, I think, of administration and leadership. And because the Lord is with him, everything that he does is being blessed. And Potiphar sees that. I don't think Potiphar fully understands how God is working through Joseph, but he's like, hey, this guy is good. Whatever he's doing, it turns out well. So he puts Joseph in front of over his whole household. So he becomes in charge of everything except, Potiphar makes a few choices for himself, like when he's going to eat, sleep, his own personal choices. But as far as like running the household and all the things that happen within, we really see Joseph growing his gifts and beginning to do that. And I think the Lord here is preparing Joseph for what is to come by starting to grow these skills within him. And being able to give him a position where he's in charge of something. And it's really awesome. So then we get to the prison, because while he's at Potiphar's house, he's falsely accused of inappropriate behavior by Potiphar's wife, who is just angry that Joseph has rejected all of her advances towards him. So he's been working for Potiphar for a while. He was there, growing and strong. And the Bible even says he was well built and handsome. But so that does kind of set us up for something like, oh, something's about to happen to Joseph. So Potiphar's wife takes an interest in him, but because he serves the Lord and he serves Potiphar, he just keeps rejecting her and trying to like avoid her and run away, and she keeps coming after him and finally, like, it comes to a point he runs out, leaving his garments behind. So she's able to fabricate this story and say, like, he came after me, and Potiphar, I honestly think he knows Joseph's character and trusts that this probably didn't happen, that his wife is probably making this up, because, I mean, think about it, he probably knows the character of his wife by now, and he knows Joseph's character, and I feel like he probably feels like this is not something Joseph would have done. But because she screamed this out, that Joseph came after her to try to be in bed with her, basically, is what she screamed it all over the household. So all these people have heard what she said. And so I think in order to save his own reputation, Potiphar knows he has to do something. So he ends up throwing Joseph in prison. And this is why I think that maybe he doesn't fully believe the story, because I think if he did fully believe and he was angry enough, he would have just had Joseph killed right then. But I think because he puts him in prison, it tells us that maybe he knows that something's not quite right about the story. But he has to do something because for his own reputation, his wife has screamed and yelled all around the household that Joseph came after her and did all these things that obviously he didn't do. And so he has to do something. So Joseph ends up in prison. So that's how we get here. So I have one more question for y'all, and there's not a lot of questions today just because there was so much of the story to go through. So I didn't really. We might have more like question and discussions when we get to the other part. So just bear with me. But I had this question I read in my book that I was reading. I thought it was interesting, so I wanted us to discuss it a little. But how are Christians to respond to slander or false charges made against them? What do you think we should do? So take a moment, discuss that. All right, so now we've made it to Joseph being in prison, actually. We talked about how he got there. So while he's in the prison, Joseph, this is found in Genesis 39, so toward the middle end of the chapter, verse 20. So Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. So again, a second time, we see Joseph in a place and the Lord is with him. Now, going back to the beginning of Potiphar, his time with Potiphar wasn't all bad. Yes, he was a servant, but he had a lot more freedom than being locked in a jail cell or thrown in a pit. So overall, so far, his best place has been Potiphar's house for while it lasted. And now he's stuck locked in a jail cell with, small space, nowhere to really go, not a lot of freedom. But the Lord is still with Joseph, even in this more difficult time. And so he showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in prison. So he basically kind of takes over the warden's job. Like the warden sees how well I don't even know like what you could do in prison at that time period to make yourself like that high standing, but something about Joseph and the way he acted in the prison like showed the warden that he could take on responsibilities. So they put him in charge of all those held in the prison. He was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. So, just based on that part of the chapter, it just sounds like the warden's like, "Here, you take my job, and I'm gonna go relax." That's kind of what it sounds like. Like, Joseph just took over the prison, and again, we see Joseph having God with him. So, something about him, I guess, the warden said, he's someone we can put in charge. So, yeah, and while he's there, in charge of the prison, Joseph is not just a dreamer anymore, but he becomes a dream interpreter. So in Genesis 40, we see the cupbearer, and the baker enter into the prison. They've upset Pharaoh, so he got mad. He threw him in the prison down there with Joseph. They each have different dreams, which Joseph interprets. So these are basically two members of Pharaoh's court. So they would have been like part of and I think um one translation calls the baker the chief baker, so he would have like overseen all of the food preparations in the kitchen, and then the cupbearer would basically, I think, bring Pharaoh his drink. And so anyway, they did something to upset Pharaoh, so they end up in prison with Joseph, and they each have different dreams, and they explain their dreams to Joseph, and he interprets them. So the cupbearer's dream indicates that he's going to be restored to his position, while the baker's dream indicates that he will likely be killed. And this is going to happen within 3 days. And everything Joseph says does come to pass. So the dreams come out correctly. And Joseph also asked the cupbearer, he wants him to mention Joseph to the Pharaoh. And he kind of explained his situation to the cupbearer, like, I was brought here from my homeland forcibly, not by my own choice. And then I was thrown in this prison and I didn't do anything wrong. So mention me to Pharaoh and maybe like try to get me out of here. But the cupbearer forgets about Joseph for 2 whole years. So, we've reached the point now. So, Joseph's in prison for a while. We're now at the palace, the last phase of Joseph's life. And the first thing I kind of wanted to talk about is just something I found interesting that I want to share with you guys, and that was, who was the Pharaoh? The answer I found out, no one knows for sure. Because I was thinking, like, I've always been kind of interested at looking at, like, lining up history with the Bible, and, like, historical documents and findings and lining up with the Bible. So I was thinking, like, who was the Pharaoh, like, that was ruling during this time period? So I went on a little research adventure to try and find some answers from the internet, and basically, yeah, nobody knows for sure. So there's some possible theories of these possible things. I don't even know how to pronounce some of these names, but these are possible pharaohs that may have served around the time that Joseph was there, and some places I looked at said it's possible there was even more than one pharaoh during that time. Like, if somebody, not necessarily, I don't know, maybe died, or just their rule was over and they passed it along, but because of Joseph's standing, he stayed for in his position. So anyway, it's unclear. I just wanted to give you guys my findings because I thought it was interesting that we can't really pinpoint exactly what Pharaoh may have been, but you can see here, one theory is that there's a Pharaoh when Joseph arrives in Egypt, so when he's with Potiphar. And then there's a Pharaoh that has the actual dreams and rules during the time of the famine and everything. And then one that is ruling around the time Joseph dies. So that's some possible theories there. So on to Pharaoh's dreams. How Joseph actually ends up in the palace is Pharaoh actually has a dream. Several dreams. Well, they're kind of like two different dreams, but the same. Joseph ends up basically explaining, like, your two dreams mean the same thing. So Pharaoh has a dream. He reaches out to all of his staff, magicians, anybody that, like, tell me what this means. Nobody's able to really figure out what it means. But then the cupbearer, he remembers, oh yeah, Joseph, the guy in jail that told me my dream and it came true. So Pharaoh has Joseph sent for, and Pharaoh lays his dreams, and basically there's going to be 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. So that's what the dreams mean. And it's in Genesis 41, we have the retelling of the dreams. Joseph gives God the glory here. So before he even hears Pharaoh's dream, Joseph tells Pharaoh this: I cannot do it, Joseph replied to Pharaoh, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. So Pharaoh's trusting in this. He already knows, like, what the cupbearer has vouched for him and said, what happened. So Pharaoh remembers probably when he did those things, because he restored the cupbearer, and then he remembers probably that he's executed his baker. I mean, it was 2 years prior, but it's probably still, when he's retold the story, it probably comes back to him. So Joseph interprets Pharaoh's dreams. He basically has dreams of 7 fat cows and 7 skinny cows, and the 7 skinny cows eat the fat cows. And then there was one with, like, bushels of wheat. And again, the skinny wheat devours and destroys the fat wheat. So basically, Joseph saying that it means you're going to have these 7 really good years of plenty, lots of food, and then we're going to have nothing. So that's kind of what he was saying, basically. So Joseph, through all this, Joseph eventually gets put in charge of Egypt, because Joseph advises Pharaoh that, like, you might want to think about, having people oversee food collection so that when the famine comes, we're prepared, because it's going to be 7 full years of famine. But if we prepare and, stock our food and eat our food wisely during the 7 years of plenty, then we're going to have food to sustain us and the nation throughout those 7 years of famine. So Pharaoh's kind of like, who's going to do this? And then he just decides, like, okay, you do it, Joseph. So he puts Joseph in charge, and everything comes to pass over those time and those 7 years. And they see the years of plenty begin, and so they start the collection because something about it, and it's just, I can only think that God's just working in this situation, that they're willing to trust Joseph on this. And obviously the people probably were just going to do it because their Pharaoh has told them that this is what we're doing. But for Pharaoh just to put his trust in Joseph, that's definitely a God moment right there, just working through everything and blessing it and making sure that this nation gets saved through Joseph. Because we're gonna see in a little bit, it's not just saving the Egyptians; it's saving some others too. So that brings us to the next part of the palace. He's in the palace a lot. There's a lot in the palace that we're not even gonna get to cover because that could have taken a whole 45 minutes all by itself. Just Joseph and his time in Egypt, and then all this stuff with his family. So we're gonna kind of summarize here, okay, the story. But basically, Joseph ends up reuniting with his family. So the famine is actually widespread. It's not just Egypt that gets struck, it reaches into Joseph's family in Canaan. So they're suffering too. So again, the people of Israel, God's people, are suffering. And through Joseph, they're going to be saved because his family hears Egypt has food. So Jacob sends his son to Egypt, and they have to speak to Joseph because he's the one in charge of it. He's the one, like, you know, he's overseeing all the food collection and the distributions, making sure people don't take more than they should so that they can get the food to last the 7 years. And this is probably like, I think one of my books said maybe like a year or 2 years into the famine at this point. So it's likely that like they were reaching a point that they were running out of their food. So the famine's already kind of been going on for a little bit at this point, but it's not over. So they go to Joseph. They don't recognize him because, for one thing, it's been a long time since they've seen him. So he's grown up and he's dressed in Egyptian clothing and, you know, in this high power position in Egypt. So they don't notice him. They don't really recognize him. And they probably don't get super close to him when they speak to him. So, but Joseph goes through a series of tricks and questions because he instantly recognizes the brothers. And he wants to see basically if the brothers have changed his heart or changed their hearts. And he does this through a series of tricks. The main one being he plants a silver cup in Benjamin's sack, the youngest son. And they've actually taken multiple trips to Egypt to see Joseph because he keeps sending him on, different things. And there's a lot to go into. But basically, this is what he ends up doing is all of this things he makes them go through is really to see, like, have their hearts changed and do they value each other's life, or are they sorry for what they've done? So he ultimately ends up revealing himself to them and, saying, hey, remember me, Joseph, the brother you sold? I'm here. I'm alive. And eventually they also help reunite him with Jacob. So through all of his time in the palace and everything, and again, that's a lot. That's a lot, and it's condensed into a little thing. So if you ever have time to study it, I encourage y'all to read through the whole story if you haven't read it before. I just didn't have time to go through everything that happens, but this is kind of the basics of it. Basically, he wants to, test his brothers and see if their hearts have changed before he tells them, "Hey, I'm Joseph, the one you sold away." And then they have even trouble, when they have to go back and tell Jacob Joseph's alive, because they have to admit they lied to Jacob about Joseph's death and that they sold him. So there's a lot of stuff, family drama they have to kind of hash out. But that's the main essence of what happens. So, sorry it's in a shorter version. But anyway, I want to go on to what we can learn so we can finish on time today. And again, I went with the same letter. letter. We went with some alliteration. So we can learn perseverance from this story, purpose, process, and plan. So we're gonna walk through those and have a little discussion in our last 15 minutes or so together. First one I thought about like perseverance because Joseph goes through a lot. So I think it teaches us that we should have some perseverance in all situations. And Joseph just kept going. He remained with God. And I thought it was interesting reading back through the story again. He really didn't, like, we don't see Joseph read a prayer or anything. And I don't know if they had any scriptures to really study at this point. And if they did, Joseph surely didn't have them with him when he went to just check on his brothers. And then, so if anything, all he really had was prayer and talking to God, but we're not shown any of his prayers in the story. So I thought that was interesting, but yet God is with him the entire time. And it's clear through Joseph's actions and the way that others respond to him that something about him and something that he's doing is clearly he's staying in a relationship with God, and through prayer or just his attitude about everything and the way that he continues to use his gifts that God gave him everywhere and in all situations. He just keeps going. And I thought of this too, like being resilient even in difficult times. And so for us, I think we can remember that God is with us when you walk with him daily, because I don't think Joseph could have gotten through this if he wasn't thinking about God and doing or trying to even do what God wanted him to do. And I'm sure even though we don't see him pray or hear a prayer that he offers up to God, I'm sure he is constantly praying and knowing and reminding himself that God's with me, God's going to bless this, and I'm just going to follow the path that God puts in front of me. So I think that's kind of like his attitude toward everything, is that just to keep going. Like, wherever I am, I'm going to just do the best that I can. And we see that all through it. Obviously, he's not in the pit very long, but in Potiphar's house, in the prison, and even in the palace, he's just walking with God constantly and letting God guide him and use him to be this important figure and to save the people, not just the Egyptians, but even his own family that will become the 12 tribes of Israel. So saving them and their families from this famine, God uses him. And then purpose. I thought about the word purpose came to mind thing about this story. And I thought of like purpose through obedience. And it kind of goes in hand with the perseverance, but I thought of it more of like because we're obeying, we have a purpose. And Joseph obeyed God by accepting the things that were happening to him. And instead of trying to like run away or, he probably at one point could have run away from Potiphar's house and tried to travel back to his own home. But instead he just stayed put. And I feel like he maybe realized that there's a purpose here. I don't know what it is, but I'm going to just stay here. I'm going to do my work. I'm going to be obedient to God if this is where I am right now. So I thought of that, of like being obedient during highs and lows. And that at each point in his life, God had a purpose for him. And it all led to him being the ruler of Egypt. And that even was even a bigger part of a plan for all of Israel, because his family, who became the 12 tribes of Israel, they came for rescue and uh, for food during the famine there. But it also thinking about purpose also kind of made me think of the story of Esther a little bit, because it was kind of similar how we're told several times, at least three, I think, in the story that God was with Joseph. But again, like I said, we never see Joseph really pray to God. And I thought of that kind of compares to the story of Esther, where we don't really see God mentioned at all, but we see the way he works. And then I love this quote from Mordecai. Um, it made me think of purpose in all things in Esther 4:14. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And this is the part that I really thought of with for Joseph too. It kind of works. I mean, and who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. So that's Esther's story. She's in a place where she's got a purpose too. And maybe you're in this position um because you're needed to be. And I feel like that goes for Joseph too. He was there right when he needed to be. And I think we can think about that in our own lives. Like, is there what's my purpose here? And God may not reveal it to you, to be honest. But just, I think, knowing and thinking about that there's a purpose for us in any situation, a big or small situation, and just like taking comfort in that is, I think, an important thing we can do. Like, we may not understand the purpose or where we're heading or where God's leading us, but we can be hopeful that and comforted, I think, by the fact that okay, there is a purpose here. Even if I don't know it yet, I'm going to trust God, and this goes into the next part as well. They all kind of tie together. But the process. And I was thinking of process through faithfulness because Joseph trusted God and remained faithful, doing his work, giving God the glory for the interpretations of the dream. So before he even explained his dream to Pharaoh, he said, "It's not me, it's God that's giving me the meaning of your dream." So, trusting in God and trusting the process. And I thought of this quote, it's a marathon, not a sprint, right? We're not meant to rush through life or rush through things that we're going through. It's just small steps. So, trusting that process of where God is leading you and having hope in that again, of like knowing maybe I don't fully understand what's going on or where this is leading, but if I'm trusting God, then I'm probably in the right place doing what I'm supposed to be doing, and I need to just trust him. Because sometimes we can't see the bigger picture, but trusting God and trusting the process is the best thing that we can do. And that leads me to the next part, and the last part that I think we can learn from this story is that plan. Because God has a plan, and God's plan can give us hope. So these all kind of tied together, but they're like different, a little bit different in different ways. So Joseph couldn't see his path ahead or how his original dreams might come to pass, but he trusted that God had a plan and continued to do his best every day. So I think we can also do that. He focused, I wrote here, Joseph focused on what was in front of him, the present. He didn't dwell on the past and what had happened to him, and he didn't really worry too much about the future. He did what he could in those moments. So I think that's a good thing for us to focus on is knowing, yes, that God has a plan, but we don't maybe have to know the whole plan and see the path ahead and where it's going. It's not it may not always be so easy, but just being there in the moment and in the day and focusing what and doing what you can for that day, um, I think is awesome. And it reminded me, I got the famous, a popular scripture here, Jeremiah 29:11, for I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. So I think that we can learn from Joseph's story is that there was a bigger plan at work, even not just even for Joseph's life, but even for his the nation of Egypt to continue going on, and the nation of Israel. He had a bigger plan for them. He brought them into the land of Egypt through Joseph. Um because like as I didn't get a lot of time to go into it, but he does end up bringing his family to live closer to Egypt so he can, for one, I think, be with them again. He's been away from them for so long, and then he can, provide for them through the collected food and make sure they survive the famine. So they basically move up closer to Egypt, and they're given land, and the whole family moves there. So through all that, God is um has this bigger plan that we couldn't even see, that doesn't even didn't even affect just Joseph. It was bigger plan than he could even control, and that may be something, we might be a part of a bigger plan like that we just don't realize. So I think we can take the comfort again in knowing that God has purpose for where we are in our everyday life, and that there's a bigger plan for us even if we can't see the road ahead. So that's kind of the difference I wanted to point out with like purpose and plan. So like purpose, think being more of like, what's my purpose today in this moment, like what can I do to be my best self today. And then plan is more of like, I thought it more of like for long term, like that we can't always, that's why I have the picture of this pathway here. We can't always see the path ahead. Like Joseph didn't know where this was really going and what would happen, but he just focused on the moment that was in front of him and dealt with that. And so I said, like, focusing on the right now, spending each day with him as the trail guide of your life. So, anyway, you guys have any questions or thoughts, comments you want to make about the story of Joseph that sticks out to you? So, all right, and then I have a couple last things. I'm kind of done with the main lesson, but we do have the play today. It's a musical with great songs, and if you aren't able to go to the play with us, or at any point, you can see the movie version starring Donny Osmond, and this is the movie poster. It's available. I found it. You can get it on Prime Video, Apple TV, or YouTube, and you could just like, it's like a, you could do the rental, or if you have one of those, um, I think you have to rent it no matter what on any of them, but it's definitely worth a watch if you get a chance. So if you weren't able to join us to see the play, then I highly encourage you to watch the movie version, and it's just a fun story. And then I wanted to share with you some resources about Joseph. I actually read this one all the way through. I didn't get to finish the second one here, but I want to. Just some resources, some studies, if you want to learn more about Joseph's story and his life, and so yeah, that's all I have for you guys today.